The sun was a hammer, and the desert was the anvil. For 15 years, Clint Reynolds had been the nail, beaten into a shape he no longer recognized. He rode with the mechanical indifference of a man whose soul had been baked out, leaving only a brittle shell of duty. The heat shimmered off the alkali flats, making ghosts of the distant mesas, and Clint saw them for what they were, monuments to emptiness, his emptiness. He was tracking 3 stray heifers, not because he cared for the coin they would bring, but because it was a motion to perform, a series of actions to fill the hollow hours between a sunrise he didn't welcome and a sunset that brought no peace. His world had shrunk to the creak of saddle leather, the grit of dust on his teeth, and the vast, oppressive silence where a child's laughter used to be. Faith was a currency he had spent down to nothing long ago. Hope was a dry well, its stone lip crumbled to dust. He crested a low rise, the landscape before him a study in ochre and scorched umber, and that's when he saw it, an anomaly. A disruption in the crushing monotony of sand and scrub. A lone burro, its dun-colored coat almost perfectly camouflaged, was tied by a frayed rope to the skeletal remains of a Palo Verde tree. It stood placidly, its long ears drooping in the heat, a small saddle pack slung over its back. It wasn't the presence of the animal that snagged on the raw edge of Clint's attention. It was the stillness, the deliberate tethering. No prospector, no traveler, would leave a pack animal tied in the open furnace of the sun. It was a death sentence. Clint swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the hot sand. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the baked earth. He approached the burro slowly. It watched him with large, dark, intelligent eyes that held no fear, only a profound weariness that resonated with his own. Its coat was matted with dust, and a line of dried saliva marked its muzzle. He ran a calloused hand along its neck, feeling the heat radiating from its skin. He pulled his canteen, uncapped it, and poured a stream of precious water into his cupped palm. The burro drank greedily, its soft lips tickling his skin. It was an intimacy he hadn't felt in a decade and a half, a simple connection to another living thing that felt alien and unwelcome. He was a man who lived with ghosts. The living were a complication. He untied the knot. The rope was old but tied with a purpose that felt recent. He scanned the horizon in all directions. Nothing. No tracks but the wind's own, erasing all history. The land kept its secrets. He turned his attention to the small leather saddle pack. It was scuffed and worn, the kind a child might use for play. A cold dread, familiar and ancient, coiled in his gut. He didn't want to open it. Whatever was inside belonged to a story that wasn't his, a life that had trespassed on his carefully curated wasteland of memory. For 15 years, he had asked no questions of the universe, and it had offered him no answers. The arrangement suited him, but the burro's gentle, trusting eyes held him captive. He owed the creature for its quiet companionship in this brief, strange moment. With a sigh that seemed to pull up dust from the bottom of his lungs, he unbuckled the straps. The contents were few. A half-eaten apple, now brown and shriveled, a small, tightly rolled strip of canvas, and a child's drawing on a creased piece of paper. His breath hitched. The world tilted on its axis. He unrolled the drawing, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. It was rendered in charcoal, clumsy and earnest. A tall stick-figure man with a wide-brimmed hat stood beside a much smaller stick-figure girl with wild, spiraling hair. They were holding hands. Above them, a lopsided sun shone, and beside them was a crude rendering of a house with a crooked door. His house. He knew it as he knew the scars on his own hands. But it was the detail in the corner that shattered the fragile dam of his composure. A small, wobbly crescent moon, drawn exactly the way Ruth had always drawn it. Her signature. Her mark on the world. He sank to his knees in the hot sand, the drawing clutched in his fist. A sound escaped his throat, a ragged, strangled thing that was half sob, half curse. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the heat. a phantom conjured by a mind starved of meaning. Ruth was gone, taken, vanished into the thin, merciless air 15 years ago at the age of 6. Sarah, his wife, had been unraveling then, a tapestry of fears and accusations woven by a sickness in her mind. She'd screamed that he was a danger, that his temper was a thundercloud, that he would hurt their child. And then one day, they were both gone. Sarah was found a week later, her horse wandered back to the ranch alone, her body discovered at the bottom of a dry wash, but Ruth was never found. The lawman had called it a tragic accident, a mother fleeing with her child and succumbing to the desert. Clint had called it a void, a hole in the center of his life that had swallowed everything. He forced himself to look at the drawing again. The style was hers, the childish, fierce concentration in the lines. He remembered her sitting on the porch steps, tongue stuck out in concentration, her small hand gripping a piece of charcoal. "That's you, Daddy," she'd said, pointing to the tall stick figure. "And that's me. And this," she'd tapped the crescent moon, "is our secret, so we can always find each other." A cruel, impossible joke. He looked at the gentle burro, which had moved closer and nudged his shoulder with its head. Its eyes seemed to hold a question. He fumbled in the saddlebag again, his fingers closing around something small and hard. He pulled it out. A button. A small, simple sky blue button. His vision swam. It was from her favorite dress, the one she'd been wearing the day she disappeared. He remembered the dress, the cheap cotton printed with tiny yellow flowers. He remembered the missing button, a casualty of a tumble from the porch swing. He had promised to sew it back on for her, a promise he never got to keep. The evidence was ludicrous. A 15-year-old drawing, a button from a dress long since turned to dust. It made no sense. And yet, the burro stood beside him, a solid, living thing. It was real. The drawing was in his hand. The button was warm against his palm. He looked at the animal, truly looked at it, and saw the network of old scars on its flank, the marks of a hard life. One scar, however, was different. It was cleaner, more deliberate. Etched into the hide just behind the saddle pack was a small, perfectly formed crescent moon. The hammer of the sun seemed to falter. The anvil of the desert cracked. Through that crack, a terrifying, agonizing light began to seep in. It wasn't the warm glow of hope. It was the sharp, blinding glare of possibility, and it hurt more than the darkness ever had. Clint Reynolds, a man who had made a covenant with resignation, looked at the living messenger at his side and felt the fragile seal of that covenant break. He didn't know where the burro had come from or where it was going, but the tracks of a wagon, faint but fresh, led east, toward the broken teeth of the distant canyons. With a sense of being pulled by a force he could no longer resist, he got to his feet, looped the burro's rope loosely around his saddle horn, and mounted his horse. He left the stray heifers to the ghosts and the heat. For the first time in 15 years, he was following something other than the path to his own oblivion. He was following a trail of impossible breadcrumbs, laid by a ghost who might, impossibly, be alive. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind began to howl, kicking up a blinding wall of dust. The temperature dropped, the oppressive heat replaced by a sudden, violent chill. A storm was rolling in off the high desert, one of the furious late-summer squalls that could turn the canyons into raging torrents. Clint squinted into the gale, his hat pulled low. The wagon tracks he'd been following for hours were rapidly vanishing, erased by the scouring wind. He urged his horse on, the burro trotting faithfully behind, its head lowered against the assault. He knew this land. He knew its rages. Ahead, tucked into a fissure in the rock face, was an old line shack, a relic from a time when cattlemen ran herds 100 miles wide. It was little more than a box of weathered planks, but it was shelter. He wrestled the warped door open and led the animals inside. The shack was small, musty, and dark, smelling of rat droppings and old decay. A single grimy window looked out onto the maelstrom. Wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls. Clint fumbled for the lantern he knew would be on the small, crude table, found a tin of matches, and with a few tries, coaxed a sputtering flame to life. The warm yellow light pushed back the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. He unsaddled his horse and removed the small pack from the burro, setting it on the table next to the lantern. The animal, which he had started thinking of as Charlie, the name of a stray dog Ruth had once tried to adopt, shook itself, sending a cloud of dust into the lantern light. The storm raged, trapping them in the small, intimate space. It was a confinement that forced introspection. Out in the open desert, he could let the sheer scale of the landscape swallow his thoughts. Here, in the flickering light, with the wind screaming like a banshee, there was nowhere to hide from the thing that had been rekindled inside him. This impossible hope. It felt like a fever, a sickness that made his heart ache and his hands shake. He'd spent 15 years building a fortress of numbness around the memory of Ruth. He had meticulously bricked over every window, barred every door, until the grief was a manageable, monolithic thing he could live inside. Now, a drawing, a button, a scar on a beast of burden had taken a sledgehammer to the foundations. He unrolled the drawing again under the lantern light. The details were starker now. The wild, spiraling hair. He'd always loved her hair. It was the color of dark honey and refused to be tamed, just like her spirit. He traced the stick figure man's hat. She had bought it for him at the town fair, spending all her saved pennies. It was the hat he was wearing now. His eyes fell on the crescent moon in the corner. Their secret. "It's a broken circle, Daddy," she'd explained with the solemn logic of a 6-year-old. "Like the moon. It's not whole, but you know the rest is still there, hiding in the dark. That's us. Even if we're apart, we're still a circle." A tremor went through him. He had forgotten that part. He had buried the memory so deep it had petrified. The crescent wasn't just a signature, it was a message, a promise. He looked over at Charlie the burro, who was calmly munching on a handful of dry feed Clint had poured onto the floor. The lamplight caught the scar on its flank. It wasn't a brand. It was too delicate, too precise. It looked as if it had been carved, carefully, with the tip of a knife. A crescent moon, hiding in plain sight. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the war inside him. Cynicism, his old and trusted friend, whispered that it was a coincidence, a cruel trick. People saw patterns where there were none, especially grieving men. The desert was full of madmen, prospectors driven crazy by sun and solitude, who carved symbols into rocks and animals. But the button was the anchor. It was the one piece of physical evidence that defied explanation. He took it from his pocket. It felt heavy, a small blue stone of truth. He remembered the day she lost it. They had been playing in the barn, a forbidden territory. She had climbed the hay bales, declaring herself queen of the mountain, and had slid down, shrieking with laughter. The button had snagged on a piece of baling wire. He'd found it later, lying in the hay, and had slipped it into his pocket, meaning to fix her dress that evening. But that evening never came. The next morning, she was gone. No one else in the world could have known that button was in his pocket. No one. So if the button was real, the drawing was real. And if the drawing was real, the scar was real. And if the scar was real, the message was real. Ruth. His Ruth. A part of their circle, hiding in the dark. But how? For 15 years he had believed her dead, a victim of her mother's despair and the unforgiving land. The thought that she had been alive all this time, somewhere close enough to send a messenger, was a revelation so profound it was physically painful. It recast his entire history. His grief had not been a monument to a tragedy. It had been a prison built on a lie. Who would do this? Who would take a child and spend 15 years poisoning her mind against her own father? The accusation Sarah had screamed in her final frantic days echoed in the wind. A dangerous man. It had been the rambling of a broken mind, he'd thought. But what if someone had listened? What if someone had believed her? A self-righteous neighbor, a traveling preacher with fire in his eyes. He paced the small shack, a caged animal. The hope was no longer a spark. It was a fire, burning away the comfortable decay of his resignation. And with the hope came rage, a clean, hot fury he hadn't felt in years. If she was alive, she had been stolen. If she was alive, she had been raised on lies. If she was alive, someone had to pay for the 15 years that had been stolen from them both. As the storm began to subside, its fury spent, a grim resolve settled over Clint. The wind died down to a low moan, and a sliver of watery moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the grimy window pane. He looked at the wagon tracks, now faint but still visible, leading east. They were no longer just tracks, they were a path. He saw another sign then, carved into the wooden frame of the shack's door, almost invisible in the gloom. It was fresh, the wood beneath it pale, a small, perfect crescent moon. She had been here, recently. She was leaving a trail for him, for the father she remembered, not the monster she'd been taught to fear. The destination was no longer a mystery. The tracks led toward Cedar Creek, the last bastion of civilization before the land gave way to the great empty. It was a trading post run by an old man named Tyler Marsh, a place of quiet commerce and unspoken agreements. If there were answers to be had, they would be there. Clint resaddled his horse, his movements no longer mechanical but filled with a fierce, burning purpose. He gave Charlie the burro a long look. "You've done your job, old friend," he murmured, his voice thick. "Let's go finish it." He pushed the door open. The air was clean, washed by the rain. The desert smelled of life, of wet creosote and damp earth. Or maybe it was just him. Maybe something inside him had been irrigated after a long drought. He swung into the saddle, Charlie's rope in hand, and nudged his horse into a steady trot, following the ghost of a trail eastward. He was no longer a man defined by a loss. He was a father on his way to reclaim his daughter, and he rode toward Cedar Creek with the righteous fury of a man who had 15 stolen years to avenge. The desert was no longer a tomb, it was a proving ground. The Cedar Creek trading post materialized from the heat haze like a mirage, a collection of low, sun-bleached buildings huddled around a dusty clearing. It was an island in a sea of desolation, its windmill turning with a slow, rhythmic squeak that sounded like a weary sigh. As Clint rode closer, a plume of black smoke rising from behind the main building caught his eye. It was acrid and smelled of burning paper. A sense of urgency, sharp and painful, spurred him on. He dismounted in front of the long porch, looping the reins of his horse and Charlie's rope over the hitching rail. The place was unnaturally quiet. He took the porch steps in 2 strides and pushed open the door. The interior was cool and dark, thick with the familiar sense of leather, coffee, and dust. Tyler Marsh was standing in the middle of the room, silhouetted against the open back door, through which Clint could see the source of the smoke, a bonfire in a metal drum. Tyler was a man carved from the same hard landscape as Clint, his face a road map of worry, his shoulders permanently stooped. He was feeding ledgers into the flames, watching them curl and blacken. "Tyler!" Clint's voice was a low growl. The old man started, spinning around. His eyes, usually shrewd and watchful, were filled with a hunted, exhausted dread. He looked at Clint, then at the burro standing placidly outside, and a flicker of something, resignation or perhaps relief, passed across his face. "Clint," he said, his voice raspy. "I figured you'd be coming." "The burro," Clint said, stepping further into the room. "The drawing, the button. You want to tell me what in God's name is going on?" Tyler ran a trembling hand over his face. He looked at the fire, then back at Clint. "Best you come sit," he said, gesturing to a pair of rickety chairs. "This ain't a story to be told standing." Clint didn't move. The rage that had been simmering for hours was threatening to boil over. "I'm not sitting. I'm not resting. I'm done with waiting. I've waited 15 years. Talk." Tyler Marsh let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a man surrendering a burden he'd carried for too long. She's alive, Clint. Ruth. She's alive and well. The words, the confirmation he'd been chasing across the desert, hit Clint with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of a counter to steady himself. Alive. The word was a universe. It was sunrise and birdsong and rain on a tin roof. And it was a theft. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice thick with a storm of emotions. "Who has her?" "It's complicated," Tyler began, wringing his hands. "It all started back then. With Sarah." He glanced at Clint, gauging his reaction. "You know how she was at the end. The fear. It was eating her alive. She got it in her head that you were going to hurt Ruth. She was talking to folks, anyone who would listen. Most people knew it was grief and sickness talking, but not everyone." Tyler walked over to a barrel of water and ladled himself a drink, his hand shaking. "There's a group. They call themselves the Children's Protection Society. Led by a woman named Margaret Caldwell. She's zealous. She came through here back then, heard Sarah's stories, and she believed them. She saw herself as a rescuer, a savior of children from dangerous homes." Clint felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. They took her. It wasn't a question. Tyler nodded, his eyes avoiding Clint's. "They helped Sarah run, convinced her it was the only way. The plan was for them all to go to a new settlement up north. But the desert, Sarah didn't make it. The society folks, they found Ruth wandering, alone. To them, it just proved their point. That she was an orphan rescued from a violent father and a mother who couldn't cope. So they took her in, raised her. 15 years of silence, 15 years of believing his child was dead, a casualty of his wife's broken mind. It was a lie, a systematic, deliberate lie. And you?" Clint's voice was dangerously quiet. "What's your part in this, Tyler? Why are you burning records?" Guilt etched new lines onto the old man's face. "They used this post as a way station, a drop point. I was their go-between. They needed supplies, news from the outside world. Margaret made me promise, a vow of silence. She said it was to protect the child. She swore to me you were a drunk, a man with a heavy hand. I wasn't sure what to believe. I just knew there was a little girl who seemed safe and cared for. So I kept my mouth shut." He looked at the burning ledgers with disgust. "I kept their secrets, for 15 years. And now," Clint pressed, "what's changed? Why the burrow? Why the message?" "It's Ruth," Tyler said, a note of wonder in his voice. "She's a young woman now, 21 years old. Smart, headstrong. They've filled her head with stories about you, Clint. Painted you as a monster. But they couldn't erase everything. She has memories, little fragments of happiness, a song you used to sing, the feel of your hand holding hers. These things, they didn't fit with the stories Margaret told her. She started asking questions, pushing back." He walked to the front window, peering out at Charlie the burro. "That little fella, that's her rebellion. She found him, raised him. He's the only thing that's truly hers. A few weeks ago, she came to me. She had the drawing. She asked me if I could get it to the ranch, if I could find a way. She said she needed to know. She needed to see the monster for herself." The image of his daughter, a young woman fighting a war of memory against a decade and a half of lies, filled Clint with a fierce, protective love that was almost suffocating. She hadn't forgotten him. She was still fighting for their circle. "So you sent the burro," Clint stated. "I didn't," Tyler confessed, looking ashamed. "I was a coward. I told her it was too dangerous. I told her to let the past lie. But Ruth, she's your daughter, all right. Stubborn as a mule. She must have slipped away herself, tied the burro to that tree, knowing your grazing routes. She put the button in the pack. She carved the scar on its hide herself a long time ago. She was leaving you a trail only you could read. The signs in the canyon. That was her too. She must have doubled back." A heavy silence fell over the room, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the squeak of the windmill. The full, devastating truth settled over Clint. His daughter was alive. His daughter was reaching for him, and she was in the hands of the people who had stolen her life. "Where are they now?" Clint asked, his voice flat and hard as stone. Tyler's face went pale. He wouldn't meet Clint's gaze. "That's why I'm burning the records. That's why I was hoping you wouldn't come." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "Margaret found out what Ruth did. She's not happy. She sees it as the ultimate betrayal, proof that your corruption is still reaching for the child she's aved." He took a deep, unsteady breath. "They're coming here, Clint. They're coming to Cedar Creek to put an end to it, to take Ruth away for good, somewhere you'll never find her. They're bringing an armed escort." Tyler looked past Clint, out the front door, toward the endless expanse of the eastern desert. "And they'll be here today." The word hung in the air, heavy and final as a death sentence. The quiet trading post was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, a battleground. The hope that had carried Clint across the desert had led him here, to a confrontation not just with his daughter's captor, but with the ghost of the man he was supposed to be, and the father he had to become in the next few hours, or lose his daughter all over again, this time forever. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The air grew still, charged with anticipation. Clint stood on the porch of the trading post, a sentinel carved from grief and newfound purpose. He had not moved for an hour. His gaze was fixed on the eastern horizon, where the dust met the sky. Inside, Tyler Marsh moved like a ghost, tidying things that didn't need tidying, the silence between the two men thick with unspoken fear and fragile alliance. Charlie the burro stood patiently at the hitching post, his presence a quiet testament to the impossible journey that had led to this moment. Clint's rage had cooled, banked down into a hard, dense core of resolve. Violence would be easy. It was the language he understood, the language the world had taught him. But it was the wrong language for this. He couldn't win Ruth back with a gun. He had to win her back with a button, a drawing, and the memory of a crescent moon. He had to fight 15 years of lies not with force, but with a truth so quiet and personal it could slip through the cracks of her indoctrination. Then he saw them. 3 wagons emerging from the shimmering heat, kicking up a slow-moving cloud of dust. They advanced with a grim, inexorable purpose, like a verdict being delivered. Clint's hand instinctively went to the worn grip of the pistol on his hip, but he forced it away. This was a battle of a different kind. True strength, he was beginning to understand, was not in the pulling of a trigger, but in the restraint it took to keep your hand steady. The wagons rolled into the clearing and drew to a halt, forming a defensive semicircle. Men with rifles sat in the front of the first and third wagons, their faces hard and impassive, their eyes scanning the trading post with cold professionalism. The door of the central wagon opened, and a woman stepped down. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent features and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple dark dress, but carried herself with the unyielding authority of a general. This was Margaret Caldwell. Her eyes, the color of slate, found Clint immediately, and held no flicker of doubt or guilt, only a kind of weary righteousness. She was a woman who believed, absolutely, in her own cause. She was not a monster. She was worse. She was a zealot. Then another figure appeared in the doorway of the wagon. A young woman of 21, with dark, honey-colored hair pulled back in a braid, and eyes that held a storm of confusion, fear, and a buried flicker of defiance. She was tall and slender, with a strength in her posture that was at odds with the wariness in her face. It was Ruth. His Ruth. The sight of her, a living, breathing woman, stole the air from Clint's lungs. It was like looking at a ghost and his own reflection at the same time. He saw himself in the line of her jaw, his wife Sarah in the curve of her brow. She looked at him, not with recognition, but with the guarded apprehension of someone viewing a dangerous animal. The lie had been well told. To his daughter, he was the monster in the story. "Mr. Reynolds," Margaret Caldwell's voice was crisp, devoid of emotion. "I had hoped to avoid this confrontation. You have caused this child enough pain." Clint ignored her. His eyes were locked on Ruth. He took a single, slow step off the porch, his hands held open at his sides, a gesture of peace that cost him everything. "Ruth," he said. Her name felt foreign and sacred on his tongue. Ruth flinched, taking a half step back, closer to the perceived safety of Margaret. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. It was the voice of a stranger. "He is not well, child," Margaret said softly, placing a proprietary hand on Ruth's arm. "We knew this day might come. We knew his darkness might try to find you. That is why we must leave this place." "Darkness?" Clint's voice was quiet, but it carried across the dusty clearing. "Is that what you call it? 15 years of thinking my daughter was dead? 15 years of a silence you created?" He kept his eyes on Ruth, willing her to see past the caricature she'd been fed. "They told you I was a monster. They told you I was dangerous." "My father was a violent man," Ruth recited, the words sounding rehearsed, a catechism learned by rote. "He drove my mother to her death." The words were a physical blow, but Clint held his ground. Anger would prove them right. He had to be the man from her memories, not the man from their stories. He saw Charlie the burro lift his head, his long ears swiveling toward the sound of Ruth's voice. The animal took a hesitant step forward, pulling against the rope. "That animal," Margaret said with disdain. "Your daughter formed a foolish attachment. It was a weakness we were trying to train out of her. It seems she used it to contact you." A final desperate cry for the very thing she was running from. Clint slowly reached into his shirt pocket. The armed men tensed, their knuckles white on their rifles. Margaret watched him, her expression hardening. But he didn't reach for his gun. He pulled out the small sky-blue button. He held it in his open palm, the fading sunlight glinting off its surface. "Do you remember this?" he asked Ruth, his voice gentle. "It's from your favorite dress, the one with the little yellow flowers. You were queen of the Hay Mountain. You slid down and laughed so hard you cried." Ruth's face, which had been a mask of fearful resolve, faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed her features. A hairline crack appeared in the wall of lies. I don't—" "She's lying to you, Clint," Margaret cut in, her voice sharp. "Manipulating you with fantasies." "We were on the porch swing," Clint continued, ignoring the older woman, taking another slow step forward. "And you told me about the crescent moon. You drew it for me." He gestured with his head toward Charlie. "Like the one you carved on his flank. You said it was a broken circle. You said that even if we were apart, we knew the rest of the circle was there, hiding in the dark. You said that's how we'd always find each other." He saw it then, a genuine memory, breaking through the surface like a bubble of air from the deep. Her eyes widened. The memory was not a story someone had told her. It was a feeling. The creak of the swing, the warmth of the sun, the rough texture of the charcoal in her hand. It was real. "The song," she whispered, so quietly Clint could barely hear it. "You sang a song." Clint's heart seized. He remembered, a stupid, tuneless little song he'd made up about a coyote who wanted to be a star. He'd sung it to her every night. He began to hum it, the simple, familiar melody cutting through the tense silence. It was the key. The one thing Margaret Caldwell could never have known, could never have twisted or erased. It was a piece of their shared soul. Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. The carefully constructed image of the monster shattered, replaced by the faint, beloved ghost of her father. "No," Margaret said, her voice suddenly tight with panic. She tightened her grip on Ruth's arm. "He is twisting your mind. These are tricks." But it was too late. The truth, once remembered, was undeniable. Ruth pulled her arm free. She looked from the button in Clint's hand to the scar on the burro who had been her only confidant, to the face of the man who was humming her lullaby. The face was older, etched with a grief she now understood, but the eyes were the same. They were her father's eyes. "You told me he was dead," Ruth said, turning to Margaret, her voice filled with a dawning, terrible clarity. "After you told me he was a monster, you told me he drank himself to death. You told me I was an orphan." "I did it to protect you," Margaret insisted, her composure cracking, revealing the fanaticism beneath. "To give you a life free from his shadow." "You gave me a life built on a lie," Ruth shot back, her voice ringing with the strength of her own recovered truth. She took a step toward Clint, then another. The armed men shifted, looking to Margaret for orders, but their leader was frozen, her authority dissolving in the face of a memory she could not defeat. Ruth stopped a few feet from Clint. The space between them was charged with 15 years of silence, of stolen moments and imagined grief. She looked at his weathered face, his trembling hand holding the button, and she saw not a monster, but a man who had been broken by her absence. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his neck. Clint froze for a second, overwhelmed, before his own arms came up and held her, clutching her with a desperation that spoke of 1,000 empty nights. He buried his face in her hair, which still smelled faintly of sage and dust, and a single ragged sob escaped him. The circle, broken for so long, was finally touching again. Behind them, Charlie the burro let out a soft bray, a gentle affirmation in the quiet dusk. Margaret Caldwell stood defeated, not by a bullet, but by a lullaby. The truth had been a more powerful weapon than any rifle. She gave a curt, bitter nod to her men. Without another word, they climbed back into their wagons. Margaret gave Ruth one last look, a look of profound betrayal and loss, before turning her back and ascending into the central wagon. The convoy turned and rumbled away, disappearing back into the eastern desert, leaving only a cloud of dust and a profound, echoing silence in its wake. The dust settled. The sound of the departing wagons faded into the rhythmic squeak of the windmill. The desert held its breath, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of twilight. Clint and Ruth stood locked in an embrace that was more than a reunion. It was a reconstruction, a piecing together of shattered selves. Her tears dampened his shirt, and his body, rigid with tension for so long, finally sagged with the weight of an impossible relief. There were no grand words, no speeches of forgiveness or recrimination. There was only the simple, overwhelming physics of it, a father holding the daughter he thought he had lost forever. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had been unsaid for 15 years. After a long moment, they drew apart, though they did not let go entirely. He kept a hand on her arm, as if to assure himself she was real, solid, not a phantom of the heat. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, the fear and confusion replaced by a deep, aching sadness and a nascent, fragile joy. "I remembered," she whispered, "in flashes, like a dream you can't quite hold on to, your laugh, the way you smelled of leather and sun." "I never stopped looking," he said, his voice raw. "Not in my heart." Tyler Marsh emerged from the trading post, his face etched with a quiet awe. He approached them slowly, holding out the reins to Clint's horse and the rope for Charlie. "The past is the past, I suppose," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What matters is the road ahead." Clint looked at the old trader, the man whose silence had cost him so much, but whose final act of conscience had helped pave this road. He saw not an enemy, but another man trapped by circumstance and fear. Clint gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an absolution. Forgiveness was a quiet thing, a choice to walk forward rather than look back. Ruth went to Charlie, stroking the burro's soft nose. "You found him, Charlie," she murmured. "You brought him back to me." The animal nudged her hand, a simple, steadfast friend who had carried the weight of their hope across the wilderness. The desert that had been the backdrop to Clint's despair now seemed different. The colors of the sunset were no longer brutal, but beautiful. The vast emptiness felt less like a void and more like an open space, a future waiting to be written. The ranch, which had been a mausoleum of memory, was now a destination, a home. "It's a long walk back," Clint said, his gaze on the western horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. Ruth looked in the same direction, toward a life she only remembered in fragments. "I don't mind walking," she said, a small, true smile touching her lips for the first time. "As long as I know where I'm going." Clint swung up into his saddle, his movements feeling less weary than they had in a lifetime. He reached down a hand to his daughter. Ruth took it, her grip firm and sure. He looked at her face, illuminated in the gathering dusk, and saw not just the child he had lost, but the woman she had become, strong, resilient, and whole. With Charlie the burro trotting faithfully beside them, a living symbol of their reconnected circle, they turned away from the Cedar Creek trading post. They began the long journey home, two figures and a pack animal moving slowly into the vast, quiet landscape. They were leaving the desert behind, but carrying its lessons with them. Home was not a place you found, but something you built. Trust was not given, but earned. And peace was not a gift, but a hard-won truce, discovered one splinter, one scar, and one quiet footstep at a time. The broken circle was beginning to heal.